Where do you go when you like to be entertained? Some people like to go out, like to a club or a restaurant, or a place like this, the Café Sevilla in the Gaslamp Quarter, where you can see authentic flamenco dance. One of my favorite things is to go to the movies. The thing is, way back in the old days, you used to feel that you could go to any movie at all, and feel comfortable taking the whole family. As film has evolved, the art form has taken on more and more difficult and challenging subjects, and not every film is appropriate for every age group. It's not just about sex or violence or foul language. It's just about deciding whether the subject or the theme of the film is appropriate for the age of your children, whatever age they are. Well, it wasn't so different in France in the 1860s and 70s when families went to the opera. Opera, after all, was the 19th century version of entertainment, of going to the movies. Then there was a theater where society could go and bring the entire family and have a wholesome evening at the opera. It was the Opéra Comique at the Salle Favart, a beautiful little theater not far off the Boulevard d'Haussmann. Imagine the consternation of the Comique's audience on March 3rd, 1875, when they were presented with an opera whose heroine was a thieving gypsy with an unabashed attitude towards sex, who went through lovers with scandalous frequency, and which featured a knife fight, an onstage murder, and horror of horrors, women smoking on stage. It was one of those notorious operatic premieres that, even though the opera went on to become one of the 3 most popular works in the repertoire, led the composer to believe that he had been a complete failure. And unfortunately, he only had a couple of months to live and never enjoyed any of that eventual success. The composer was Georges Bizet. The opera, Carmen. I'm Nick Reveles. This is OperaTalk. Understand Carmen and where it came from, it's important for us to put the composer Bizet into some kind of historical context. So let's spend a few moments talking about opera as it existed in Paris during his lifetime. There were, first of all, a number of opera houses in Paris in the mid-19th century. There was the Théâtre Lyrique, which produced his Pearl Fishers in 1863, and about which we've spoken before. The Lyrique specialized in both French and non-French works, being the site of many French premieres of operas by Mozart, Weber, Verdi, and Wagner. There was also the Théâtre Italien, which, given its name, specialized in the Italian repertoire. The big fish in the Parisian pond was, of course, l'Opéra de Paris, the Paris Opera. And it was here that not just French composers, but every composer in Europe hoped to one day write for. The Paris Opera was an extremely conservative institution which specialized in opera on a grand scale. The dominant figure at the Paris Opera for much of the first half of the 19th century was Giacomo Meyerbeer, whose massive works defined French grand opera. These were great historical epics with large choruses, orchestras, ballets, and casts of hundreds. This was the operatic world that Bizet enjoyed while he was maturing musically and while he was working in opera theaters as a répétiteur or rehearsal pianist. Opera as an art form was being discussed in his lifetime with the same passion allotted to politics or sports today. For the most part in the 19th century, the Salle Favart, the building which housed the Opéra Comique, hosted operatic works that featured sentiment over passion, the ideal over the real. Now, in the midst of all this operatic activity, where was Bizet? Well, much of his career he spent as an arranger or orchestrator of scores and as a rehearsal pianist, as I've said. It meant that he knew the operatic repertoire inside and out, and it meant that he was a man of the theater as well as a musician. As an opera composer, however, he wasn't terribly successful until his opera, The Pearl Fishers, was commissioned by the Théâtre Lyrique in 1863. It had a respectable 18 performances and was well accepted at the time. Not long afterwards, in 1867, another of his operas, The Fair Maid of Perth, was presented at the Lyrique. Again, it had 18 performances, and again, it disappeared from sight. Many other works exist in fragments, never quite having made it to the stage. In 1871, he was finally offered a commission by the Opéra Comique for a one-act Oriental fantasy entitled Jalime. Although it didn't do well, the Comique decided to take a chance on offering Bizet a three-act commission. Now, as was common for the period, they hired the librettists and left the creators on their own to choose a subject. Well, what a subject they chose, something seemingly totally inappropriate for the family-friendly venue of the Comique, Carmen, from a novel by Prosper Mérimée. It was Bizet himself who presented the striking and original idea of setting Carmen as an opera. The Mérimée novel had been originally published in 1845, and it caused something of a scandal with all its gypsy passion, Spanish color, and colorful characters. The Comique's chosen librettists, Henri Meillac and Ludovic Halévy, were old hands at opera theater work. They had actually provided excellent librettos for Jacques Offenbach. And although they were initially scandalized by Bizet's choice, they eventually came around. After all, it gave them the opportunity to write something completely different from what they had been used to. But it was the directors of the theater, Camille Duloc and Adolphe de Leuven, who feared for the audience's reaction. In fact, de Leuven, the more old-fashioned of the two directors, was so incensed with even the possibility of Carmen being produced by the Opéra Comique that he resigned from the company. Carmen was completed by the summer of 1874, and in September, a 5-month rehearsal process began. Why so long? Well, certainly because of the revisions which were constantly being demanded by the theater. But the chorus also caused problems for the composer. At the Comique, the chorus usually stood in one spot during an opera with their eyes fixed on the conductor. They were finding it impossible to do what the composer demanded, that they actually be involved in the action of the plot. The principal singers weren't much better, but the first Carmen, Marie Galli-Marié, believed wholeheartedly in the work and in the composer. With her encouragement and support, the piece made it through the grueling rehearsal process and had its first performance on March 3, 1875. The first act was well received, but by the time the opera ended, the audience's enthusiasm had waned. They were completely bewildered, shocked, and uncomprehending at what they had seen on stage. Audiences from the second night onwards were much kinder, but the damage had been done. Although the opera had a 48-performance run, most of the audiences were papered or comped. They didn't pay for their tickets. Poor Bizet died 3 months later of a heart attack brought on by a debilitating throat condition. He was only 36 years old, and he thought his masterpiece to be a complete failure. A few months later, the opera traveled to Vienna. A student of Bizet provided sung, accompanied recitatives to replace the spoken dialogue, and Carmen was reborn as grand, tragic opera. It hasn't left the active repertoire since. The best way to set up the story of Carmen is to simply introduce you to these fascinating characters. It all takes place in Seville, in Spain, around 1830, where a young soldier, Don José, is introduced as a new member of the local garrison. He's from the country, he's a bit naive about the ways of the world, and he finds himself stationed across the plaza from a cigarette factory. A large number of beautiful women work in this factory, among them Carmen, a gypsy with some experience of men who values her independence and her freedom. She's also very honest about all these things. In fact, Carmen is probably one of the most honest characters in all opera. She doesn't pretend to be anything other than what she is, a free spirit looking for adventure and love, but always ready to move on. A woman from José's village, Micaela, arrives with greetings from his mother, as well as a reminder that she herself truly loves him. But none of this matters when Carmen and Don José finally meet, and she manipulates him into helping her escape arrest. As a result, Don José is disciplined and restricted to his barracks. But he can't forget this wild, fascinating gypsy. He finds her at Lilas Pascha's tavern, consorting with her friends, a group of thieves and smugglers plotting their next haul. Throw into the mix the toreador, the bullfighter, Escamillo. Lusty and handsome, he makes it known to Carmen that she's in his sights, and he's rarely turned down by any woman. Carmen and Don José are finally alone, and she's successful in convincing him to desert his garrison and follow her and her friends into their life of crime. But in the mountains, in the process of smuggling goods across the border, Carmen tires of him and is filled with foreboding about her fate. Escamillo comes looking for her. José confronts him, and Carmen, finally through with his naivete, his possessiveness, and his constant complaints, angrily dismisses him, forcing him to leave. All this will be resolved in the final act, with Carmen and the bullfighter proclaiming their love at the crowded bull ring, and Don José lurking somewhere in the crowd, intent on revenge. If you know the opera Carmen, then you know how it ends. If you don't, I certainly don't want to spoil it for you. All of these characters express strong passions, and it will all come to a climax at that bull ring in Seville. In order to continue our discussion of Bizet's Carmen, I've invited the resident conductor of San Diego Opera, Karen Keltner, to join me. Karen, welcome again. It's good to have you on OperaTalk.
Hi, Nick. It's great to be here.
You've conducted a number of works by Bizet. Dr. Miracle, I know, in your past,
My youth.
In your youth, when you were involved with the San Diego Opera Center, and Pearl Fishers most recently, and now Carmen. I know you've conducted Carmen a number of times before. When you look at these three works, the operatic works of Bizet as a whole, what can you tell us about his style? How did he approach opera theater?
Well, I think those three, just happenstance, happen to be the early, middle, and later parts of his career, at least musically, and one can tell that, I think, at least as a conductor, and I suppose as an auditor, by the level of naivete which diminishes, let's say. There's still this certain element there, which I think is one of the things that always pleases a listener without his or her understanding why. There's always that freshness to Bizet. But what he does in Carmen, as opposed to what he did in Dr. Miracle in terms of developing material, is
light years there.
Yeah, exactly, truly.
Yeah.
And Pearl Fishers is partly because of its subject matter, but also I think because of where Bizet was, perhaps. It's much more a delicate piece. It's not as brash in places. It's not quite as daring. Certainly Carmen took what Bizet's tools were at the time to his limit then at the time.
Did he become less of a typical French composer of the mid-19th century as he went on? Particularly?
I think so. I think the idea of moderation and a certain kind of refinement, which never went away from Bizet's music, certainly did not govern it in Carmen the way perhaps at least I feel it does, not to its detriment in Pearl Fishers. Pearl Fishers is the epitome of the idea of French refinement and moderation. Obviously, he pushed the envelope on Carmen, but always within a certain boundary. But certainly for the French people at that time, what was it, 1875?
Right.
More than they were ready to accept. So I think he took the ideal of French music making to a French extreme with Carmen. Yes, certainly.
Carmen appeared at a time when audiences were demanding the more exotic. Now, today we think of France and Spain, particularly since they're practically right next to each other. Well, they are right next to each other, that it's not really an exotic locale. But the world of the Spanish gypsy and the world of bull ring was certainly something that was far away from the day-to-day lives of Parisians at the time. How did Bizet, as a French composer and steeped in the French style, capture that Spanish flavor so perfectly?
The Spanish flavor, and this is an interesting question, and I looked a little more deeply into the question. I was surprised to find out, because it's no distance now to us, France and Spain. But Bizet had never set foot in Spain. Yeah. He never traveled to Spain. I think I read that the nearest he got to Spain was a checkout slip in the library of the Conservatoire in Paris for checking out some Spanish songs right before he started to write Carmen, it seems. I think primarily the Spanish influence in Carmen is delineated and put in relief by Bizet by use of the Spanish dance rhythms and Spanish, what Bizet perceived as Spanish folk songs. The seguidilla, of course, he made up, but it sounds to our ears and to the ears at the time so Spanish. I think by his use of, obviously, the rhythm, but also by his use of very limited percussion and string instruments, and once in a while a wind, a rhythm which is rather undulating and predictable and unceasing, relentless, let's say, and a single vocal line, vocal line. To look at the score, even if one didn't know that, if we didn't know the background of those specific appellations for a Spanish dance, inevitably, when we hear something in Carmen that we think is Spanish, it's either a single cello or a single instrument of some kind going boom, boop, 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 and a single vocal line. And a little bit of punctuation by pizzicati strings or some winds here and there. And then also he imitates a flamenco rhythm and with a punctuation of winds and a chorus entry sometimes in some of the things. It's a very ingenious way. I think it speaks to his genius. I really do, because he had an orchestra which was a standard orchestra, just double winds. The only thing that was different was in the percussion section, he has castanets and a tambourine, and look what he does with that.
It's amazing what he does.
He colors it Spanish, yeah. And everything else is the same as you have in practically any other orchestra of the time.
And the important thing is, it works.
It works very well, yes.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Nick.
I'm sure you're hearing something familiar about this piece of music. It's the song El Arreglito by the Spanish composer Sebastián Iradier. I fooled you, didn't I? Yes, it's quite similar to the habanera from Bizet's Carmen. Iradier's Spanish songs were very popular in the mid-19th century and were sung in recital by some of the greatest singers of the day. Some of Iradier's music was influenced by Creole music, which he'd experienced on an extended stay in Cuba. Bizet originally thought that this song was a traditional Spanish folk song, and when he realized his mistake, he acknowledged Iradier in the printed score of the opera Carmen. But it's fascinating that in Bizet's attempt to capture a true Spanish color for the opera, he would take an existing piece of music and adapt it to his purposes. What I find really interesting is how Bizet captures a Spanish flavor in the opera through the use of some suggestive rhythms. There is that habanera rhythm in this famous entrance aria for Carmen, perhaps the best known music in the score. Towards the end of the first act, there's a seguidilla, and although it's not typical of a true Spanish seguidilla, its rhythmic drive feels just right. Then there's the gypsy song at the top of Act 2. The rhythm is infectious. What's really rather extraordinary about this opera, though, is the way that Bizet uses music to describe his characters, to give them a kind of musical identity. Let's take Carmen herself. She's a gypsy. She sings, she dances. The image we all have of gypsies is they roam around the world singing and dancing. Well, Bizet does something terribly clever. Practically every time that Carmen opens her mouth, Bizet fashions a dance for her. We've already heard the most important ones, the habanera, the seguidilla, the gypsy dance. But even her most serious moment in the opera, as she's reading the tarot cards, looking at her fortune and seeing nothing but trouble and danger, the music is a slow dance of death, graceful, melancholy, and loaded with expression. And what about Don José? When we first meet him, he's fresh from the country, he's naive and open. His music early on in the opera reflects that character. Here's something from his first act duet with Micaela. But in Act 3, he's become sullen, angry. He feels out of place with these smugglers. Bizet has Don José's music become more angular, dissonant, even disjointed in order to show his development as a character within the story. And what about Escamillo? Well, he's a bullfighter, so he must be identified with the music of the bull ring. The march is the perfect form for this character because it describes not only his vocation as a matador, but his arrogance and his machismo. Musical composition is about making choices. Bizet's choices for Carmen were perfect. In order to get to know Carmen better, or just to review it, you're in luck. There are now countless recordings of this opera, so many in fact that it would be impossible to review even the best ones in the short amount of time that we've got. But let me share some of my favorites with you. Here is a Carmen that many people still swear by. It's the 1964 Maria Callas recording with Nicolai Gueda as Don José, Andrea Guillot as Micaela, and Robert Massart as Escamillo. To my taste, Callas and Gueda are wonderful, but the other performances are pretty standard, not terribly exciting. But Callas as Carmen drives this performance, and it's really worth having. Georges Pret conducts the Paris Opera Orchestra. Another older version of this opera is from 1958, this release with Victoria de Los Angeles. Yes, another soprano in the role of Carmen. Again, we have Gueda, but also Janine Michaud and Ernest Blanc, all conducted by Thomas Beecham. This Carmen has real Spanish flavor. But frankly, my all-time, all-around favorite recording of this opera is the Decca release from 1975 with mezzo Tatiana Torreanos, Kirite Kanawa, Placido Domingo, and Jose Van Dam, the London Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Georg Scholti. All of the principals are superior, headed up by Troyanos, whose portrayal of Carmen is absolutely searing. On DVD, Carmen works extremely well, of course, because it's such a theatrical work. I own this Glyndebourne opera production from BBC with Anna-Sophie von Otter, Marcus Haddock, Laurent Naouri, and Lisa Milne under the baton of Philippe Jourdain. It's a strange production, but the singing is quite good. A more traditional approach can be seen in this production from the Arena di Verona with Marina Domashchenko in the title role, Marco Berti, Raymond Assetto, Maya Dashuk, and Alain Lombard conducting. It's a Zeffirelli production, so it's beautiful, active, and big. I know you'll enjoy all of these suggestions, so don't hesitate. Get your favorite recording of Carmen now and come to the Opera House fully prepared to enjoy. Carmen is one of the most popular operas ever written. There's just something about those melodies. It's hard to believe that the first audiences which were exposed to them didn't fall in love immediately. It's one of those strange ironies of opera history that when this opera was first produced, it was considered something of a failure. Thank goodness its inherent strengths kept it alive, and now, luckily for us, we can enjoy its pleasures again and again. I'm Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.